Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In this week's episode, we're discussing Twitter's launch of longform blogging tools. If there's one thing Twitter's known for, it's character limits. It famously only allowed 140 of them and then later expanded to 280. In some ways, that forced brevity made Twitter what it is today, a real-time commentary on what's going on in the world. But for years, Twitter has been trying to expand beyond its own character limits, first by launching features like photos, GIFs, and videos. It also launched a threading tool that allows you to string several tweets together. In 2021, it acquired newsletter platform Review. And then just recently, it debuted a new tool called Notes. Though it's still in the testing phase, Notes will allow users to publish longer blog posts within their Twitter feed. But is this something users actually want? Or will it eventually join the very large graveyard of social media features that never caught on? To answer this question, I brought on Ernie Smith. Not only is Ernie one of the foremost experts on publishing platforms and newsletters, but he also got early access to Twitter Notes and tested them out for himself. He gave me his initial reactions to the tool, and we discussed whether it would usher in an era of long-form writing to Twitter. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about today's sponsor. Here's a fun puzzle for you. What do a phone call with Ryan Reynolds, 50 pounds of elk meat, and a secret handshake all have in common? They're all genuine rewards used by newsletter operators in their Spark Loop referral programs to grow their audiences up to 200% faster. Curious what kind of referral rewards would take your audience growth to the next level? The SparkLoop team can help you figure it out in a free strategy call. Head over to sparkloop.app, book in your call today, and set yourself on track to smash through your audience goals for 2022. Visit sparkloop.app. That's SparkLoop.app. I'll leave a link in the description. Okay, now on to my interview with Ernie. Hey, Ernie, thanks for joining me.
Hey, how's it going?
Well, it's good to have you on again. Longtime listeners to this podcast know that I think I've had you on at least once, possibly twice. But for this one, instead of going through kind of your own kind of personal history with your very successful newsletter career, I wanted to kind of bring you on to talk a little bit about something that's sort of in the news lately, especially within the content media newsletter space, and it's Twitter's like continued ventures into long form content, getting beyond its purview of 140 and then 280 characters. But just to kind of refresh the memories of my listeners, let's talk just a little bit about your background. So you are a very successful newsletter creator. You run your own newsletter. You actually run two newsletters now. What are they?
One of the newsletters I run, probably the one I'm best known for, is called TDM. It's the dull side of the internet. It's a twice weekly newsletter that focuses on history, obscurity, just basically whatever weird stuff pops into my brain. It's very long form. It's very it's very offbeat. Sort of that general approach. But it's very off cycle as far as what it tends to cover. It's not based on the news cycle at all, really. But there's obviously a place for that with some of my writings. So I started up a second newsletter called Mid-Range, which is actually a 3 times a week newsletter. So it's the newsletter I work on during the weekdays I'm not working on TDM. And it's basically for the most part, it tends to be things that are on cycle, and it tends to be more of the hot take variety. I give myself a 30-minute deadline to write the issues, and hopefully it's readable at the end of it.
Yeah, and you were hosting Mid-Range on Review, which is a newsletter company owned by Twitter, but you moved off of it a few months ago, right?
Yeah, I'm in the midst of trying to get it onto the TDM website. It's most of the way there. I'm not done yet, though.
Yeah. And so, part of the reason I'm talking to you is because in addition to being, a really good newsletter creator, you also understand the mechanics and design of newsletters probably better than most people I know, including myself, because you were very much into crafting and designing and testing the limits of like newsletter software. Like you've designed, like Substack or Review or some of these other platforms. It's very cookie cutter. You can pick a few templates, but you have to stay within those confines. But you're kind of pushing the limits of newsletter design within the inbox, right?
Yep. Basically, I've always sort of seen it as like, yeah, my background is beyond being a writer. I also spent a number of years as a graphic designer. So as a result, like design and writing kind of go hand in hand for me. So as a result of all that, like I prefer to sort of roll my own things. And TDM and now with mid range, I'm starting to just basically like try to build my own templates for everything and just kind of like ease the process of actually building out these things so it's not so yeah, so like it has like a unique feel for what I'm personally doing, but also like, I have ownership of it all too.
Yeah, yeah, and you're very much into that sort of control, being able to control the destiny, the future of your newsletter, keeping it very, Web 2.0 decentralized, not being too reliant on a single platform.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. I think that that's a good way to put it all.
So, and you also run a Facebook group called Newsletter Nerds. It's kind of like a support community for newsletter creators where we can kind of troubleshoot and share tips and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's definitely got the vibe of a support group in case anybody is wondering.
Yeah. So now that we've established your credentials as someone very knowledgeable on newsletters and content management systems, let's get into talking about Twitter's forays into this and how it's done a lot of interesting stuff for the last few years to kind of expand beyond its a initial purview of 140 characters. So Twitter's been moving beyond the 140 character limits for a while, in the sense of it started several years ago. I don't know if it was a whole decade ago or sooner than that. They started allowing things like uploading images, GIFs, video that didn't contribute at all to its 140 characters. So that was kind of pushing the limits of what the purpose of Twitter was. And then it eventually famously expanded from 140 characters to 280 characters that they saw after they saw some data, I think, coming out of Japan or somewhere, showing that users who had a few extra characters became more highly engaged. They launched the 280 characters for worldwide, and it's been a I think a pretty strong success. I think it's improved being able to just give us a little bit of extra wiggle room in terms of more cogently laying out our thoughts. And then they also invented these things called Twitter threads, which while keeping the spirit of the 280 characters, has allowed us to kind of group together tweets so we could say something longer. I think we could debate over whether Twitter threads have been good or bad in terms of long form writing on the internet. But we first kind of got the inkling that they were thinking about something longer. And I wonder if you remember this. This was back in 2015, 2016. It started to leak within the tech press. And I think Jack Dorsey even officially commented on this a little bit on Twitter, is that Twitter was building a tool that would allow for people to write more long form articles or long form content on Twitter that had as high as a 10,000 character limit. Do you remember this?
It sounds like one of those things that I'm sure just randomly gets mentioned on Twitter and everybody freaks out and within a week it's gone.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what happened, is that is that there was such a backlash, and I think even the Twitter stock price tanked, and Jack Dorsey very quickly kind of announced that they were pulling the project and they weren't going to do it. But eventually they launched this thing called Notes, which I think is basically something similar in idea. And I think what got lost in all the coverage is people thought that all of a sudden Twitter was we were going to start having these super long tweets within the feed that just took up a lot of space. But I think from what I gathered of the initial coverage back in 2016 is that there would still only be 140 characters that you saw, and you had to click to see more. I mean, like, what are your kind of thoughts on that in terms of the essence of Twitter in the feed should have that kind of character limit that each tweet is like, only 280 characters. Like, do you think that's kind of, you would be able to create a long form product and still keep within the spirit of what Twitter is, as long as you only made like so much of it visible within the feed?
Yeah, I think that there's probably a good argument for differentiation, and the other thing I would point out as well is like, while I'm not necessarily suggesting that they're exactly the same, but probably as far as social networks go, the most Twitter-like thing out there that isn't Twitter is Mastodon, and actually that actually has a character limit of 500 characters, and it doesn't feel like significantly different from Twitter to me, on a day to day basis. So I don't necessarily think that like you lose a ton by lengthening the character count. I mean, certainly 10,000 characters is,
Yeah,
I,
yeah.
you
That's
don't
a
want to
significant expansion of the character count. Yeah.
read a novel every time you load Twitter. You want to like have sort of a happy medium where you have this quick hit thing, and if you want to read more, there's a lot there's a lot that you can do with that. But I think that one thing that we've sort of seen with the newsletter space is people having a ton of success with the medium, where obviously they're writing a ton of stuff like targeted at Twitter, like in terms of like commentary and such. But people are wanting to read more on top of that, which will lead to like these threads where like people write these really interesting things, but at the end of the thread, conveniently, or like in the first reply to a very viral tweet, there'll always be that link like check out my Substack.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that kind of speaks to why Twitter has been wanting to launch a long form, product, is because basically it's been serving as like the jumping off point for that. Like, I'm sure you've heard this before, but a lot of people say that like Substack probably gets a lot of its traffic from Twitter, because like these writers are building up these huge Twitter followings, and then they're monetizing it through Substack. So my guess is, and I don't know if you think this, is Twitter's probably been looking at that as kind of like a lost opportunity, that their Twitter is the place to build that audience, but then they're just sending it away to try to monetize it elsewhere.
I think that that's absolutely the case. I think it's definitely a situation where if I were running a network like Twitter and seeing like some of my smartest people like looking elsewhere to like share their information and share like their insights, like I would be like, well, how do I you know how do I get the genie back in the bottle? How do I how do I like try to try to get like a little bit more control over all of this?
Yeah, and for the longest time, obviously, Twitter threads were kind of like the closest thing to long form content. But I've never like really loved Twitter threads, in the sense of like I groan a little bit when someone decides to do a Twitter thread instead of just writing it as a blog post. I'm just like, why couldn't they have just written this down? I'm having to like, because a lot of times like somebody will retweet a thing, like a tweet within a Twitter thread, and then you have to scroll to the top and figure out where the beginning is and all this kind of stuff. I don't know. What level of annoyance do you have when you get confronted with a long Twitter thread that you have to scroll through?
Well, it's interesting because like I think that one of the things that's really great about Twitter threads, I mean, like I'm not necessarily like seething every time I see one personally, but I think that often what happens that's kind of cool is you'll occasionally see these writers who have like a very who have built like a very strong base for themselves. There's there's this one guy. I think his name is Mike Soden. I believe that's what it is. If I'm wrong, I apologize, Mike. But he's used Twitter threads for his Substack newsletter, which is called "Everything Is Amazing," to amazing effect. And like I just remember one day, like I like saw one of his threads, and I was just like, wow, this guy came out of nowhere. Like I had known him for years, but he kind of came out of nowhere with his approach to Twitter threads, where it just like it seemed to have like these really strong network effects that you know I just I felt like when I saw that I couldn't really discount the power of the thread as a way for somebody, for an original writer to like really, you know, pull their weight like on Twitter. I mean, is it
And what
annoying?
what was he doing? Like he was taking his long form article that he had published and then breaking it, breaking down all the key points in a Twitter thread. So if you wanted to just consume like some small part of it, you could, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, and there was some of that. I think that like, sort of, a lot of what he writes tends to play into a little bit of a sense of wonder. So, as a result, like that sort of sense of wonder, like gets conveyed in the Twitter thread, which you know, there'll be some of like that explanation, but at the same time, you don't want to give away everything if you're like building out like a polished newsletter, and like I think that there's like always this balance of like, how strategic do you get as far as like your trying to share your tweets in this very regimented format, and what do you keep on the other side of the on the other side of the paywall, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
um, One other thing I'll add to that though is I think that from a user standpoint, even if it's pulled totally out of context, there is value to like people being willing to share like smaller portions of the full thread, and that like sometimes that small nugget like you know it becomes.
Allows the rest of the thread to go viral in some ways because that one nugget kind of stands out.
Yeah, exactly. So it has like a very, it's sort of like it plays into the network effects, because like even if like, you know, it gives you basically a lot of chances to have success with the thread, I guess.
Yeah, Judd Legume does it to great effect. He's a liberal politics writer on Substack, where he'll publish a big investigative piece, and but then he'll publish a Twitter thread that's like 20 tweets long, kind of just sharing, bits and pieces of the information he got from his investigation, usually around, the corporations that are funding Republicans that are, trying to, block abortion access or different stuff like that. And I had him on the podcast, and he talks about how that creates like a feedback loop where one individual tweet can go viral and that can kick off virality up and down the thread and drive subscribers and stuff like that. So it can be done Twitter threads can be leveraged to great effect. I am forced to use Twitter threads whenever I have a thought that's longer than 280 characters, but I don't. It's not so much that I want to write about like dedicate a whole newsletter to it. And so I get basically forced to tweet 3 or 4 tweets in a row that kind of break down some of my thoughts on a specific subject. But I've always been kind of frustrated by being forced to do that. I always wish I could like basically create like a 400 to 500 or 400 word little blog post that's contained within Twitter. And I think my hope is that's what this Twitter notes feature, turns out being. But just briefly, one other thing I want to touch on, and I don't know, this is another tidbit of news that was kind of like a flash in the pan. But do you also remember that at one point, Ev Williams, who is a co-founder of Twitter and now the CEO of Medium, was lobbying Twitter to buy Medium?
It sounds like something that was probably bound to happen. I mean, I just, you know, I think with Medium, like I've had, from a personal perspective, I've had some success with them in the past as far as like individual pieces, and having been able to build out a network. But I don't know, something seemed to have like gotten disconnected over time. Like it just doesn't feel like the network effects translate as well on that medium.
Yeah. I mean, it's just been it's kind of been sad for me to watch because like I think I was an early supporter of Medium. It's really the first platform that really kind of tried to apply network effects to long form writing. It just pivoted too many times and never seemed to find its footing. I don't have any insider's knowledge, but it just seems like it never took off in the way that like a Twitter or a Facebook or some of these other super successful platforms took off, and it still seems to be struggling to find figure out what it is. It's more like a Quora where it has like its own dedicated user base, so it definitely has some influence, but it never seemed to kind of break out into the stratosphere. But it would have been interesting to see what a Twitter acquisition would have been. My guess is they would have gotten bored with it pretty quickly, and then it would have been considered to be another Vine or something like that. But anyway, that's an alternate reality we can talk about. But anyway, so that kind of brings us to their launch of these things called Notes, which is kind of which looks like if they do release it to the public, is going to be kind of their new long form blogging platform that kind of exists within the feed. So you got like early access to Notes? How did that come about?
I think that a big part of that is just sort of like, I've, I, even though I personally was like leaving review, like I wasn't like, I will admit that like the reason why I pulled mid range from review was because I was very uncomfortable with the whole, Elon Musk purchasing Twitter. And,
Mm-hmm.
Despite that, I, I still had like good relationships with the folks there. And, like, I think that like, because I've like done my homework as far as like different newsletter platforms, like I've tried dozens of them over the years, and I tried a lot of CMS platforms over the years. So, like I've tried to get a good understanding of the space, and with that in mind, I think that like I think that there's probably a bit of value for someone like me to just hop in, to something new like this and just like offer their feedback. I mean, and kind of be honest about it. And you know, I've only published one thing thus far, which I kind of gave like sort of an absurdist name. I'm calling it Flannel Channel to as sort of a reference to hashtags.
Yeah.
But basically the thing that I'm trying to do with it is, try to just have fun with it, but also like highlight, okay, here's what I think is working about this platform, and here's what isn't, and try to do it in a way that's like, somewhat public facing, so I can at least say like, okay, here's where, here's where things are at, and hopefully as the test goes on, like, these things will be improved, and, whatever they decide to do with it, like it'll become a, it'll show like early on, okay, this is where we started. It was a bit rough, but now, now it's getting much closer to something that you might actually want to use. So
Yeah.
I think that, so I think that for me, like, I happen to, I guess part of it is just like I have a reputation of just sort of like trying to follow the newsletter space and like what's working and what's not, and like try to try to keep try to get an understanding of what makes the most sense. And while Notes is obviously not like a newsletter tool specifically, it has a lot of newsletter style cues, like it like.
Well, it looks like a review. Like it seems like the design is very similar. Like you could tell that they maybe imported some design or code or something like that from review. It seems to me.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a degree of that. I will say that the formatting at this time is probably more robust on review, but and
Hmm.
review isn't like super robust as far as like you know rich text tools go, to be clear.
Yeah.
But Twitter at this point, it's not like you can like center any of the center anything, for example, and like images are kind of set sizes, and they're it's early, but at the same
Yeah.
time, I think that like for Twitter, there's probably this degree of when you strike a balance between, okay, like we got to keep this simple because what we're known for with Twitter is like simple communication, but I think that like with long form stuff, there's more of an expectation of like having some degree of like, okay, you know, I want to be able to do this with my type. I want to be able to bold this. I want to be able to, occasionally center stuff. Like,
Yeah.
but I think that if they figure out that balance, it'll be a good tool.
Well, let's zoom out a little bit. Well, first, like, so I forgot, I kind of skipped over this. So, Twitter acquired Review, which is largely thought of as like a Substack competitor. It was like a free, or it wasn't free at the time, but they made it free. A newsletter publishing platform that also has, paid subscriptions like Substack. They bought that in early January. What was kind of like your initial thought when they bought that? This is their first like really kind of platform that's owned by Twitter that you could publish long form content to. Like, was that exciting to you, or what was kind of your thoughts about Twitter acquiring Review as a strategic choice?
I'm gonna play my nerd card a little bit here and point out this is actually the second acquisition of a long form blogging style newsletter style platform that Twitter has done, because they
What
they
was the other
also
one?
they acquired Posterous about a decade ago, which
Oh, I forgot that even existed. What did they do
yeah,
with that? Nothing.
nothing. It was, and I feel that for the two or three people that remember that listen to this podcast,
It
they're
was
gonna
a
just
Tumblr competitor, right?
yeah, it was a Tumblr competitor. So it's, like they're gonna just be like, yeah, that's, like this guy gets me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I somehow didn't remember that they bought that, but I do remember Posterous existing. Wow. Okay, so that is good. Good that you got that caveat aside. But so they buy Review. I was super excited as someone who wanted more competition against Substack. I was excited that like for the possible network effects synergy that Twitter was going to have. I was like, oh, what are all the things they're going to do with newsletters and Twitter and allowing you to grow your audience, you leveraging your Twitter following? Were you kind of like thinking there would be all these kind of synergies that they would roll out?
I think that obviously Twitter has more of a reputation as sort of like they add features, but like they're not adding features like at the pace of say a LinkedIn or a Facebook in terms of just like throwing new things at the wall. Like I think that like one of the things that like Twitter has done, which maybe it's limited their growth to some degree, but I think at the same time it's also like created like a more stable experience for the end user, is that like they haven't been like nuts about like just adding a ton of new features every single week. That's sort of picked up in the last year or two, but like with that in mind, like I sort of went into it like, okay, review seems like a good acquisition for them. I already knew the review team to some degree because of my background in newsletters, but I think that at the same time, I wasn't trying to like suggest, okay, well, obviously there's going to be this deep integration like with review like 2 weeks after like Twitter buys it.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I gotta say, I was kind of disappointed. At least before the launch of Twitter Notes, where it's clear that they were working on some more long form features, but like they quickly rolled out integration where you could sign up for someone's review within Twitter. But then I got kind of disappointed because they rolled out something called Super Follows, which is a paid subscription thing. And I was thinking, like, oh, this could have all great synergy with review, because if you become a paid subscriber to a review newsletter, maybe if there's like a Twitter account associated with that review, then you get like these exclusive tweets that only paying subscribers get. But there never seemed to be any kind of integration between like review and Super Follows. So like I started to think like, is this another Vine, another kind of startup that they acquired and they kind of, got bored with? I don't know. Did you feel like they were, because like Substack is releasing new products, new updates, new tools, like sometimes on a weekly basis, but like Review, correct me if I'm wrong, it really hasn't changed that much since they acquired it.
No, as far as I can tell, it hasn't been like a significant number of like massive upgrades to it. I mean, because
Yeah.
obviously there are certain things that like yeah, it would have been beneficial for review users to have. Like I think that I think for example like there's a lot of there's a lot of companies that have sort of crept up around the newsletter space in the last 4 or 5 years that like offer different things like you know referral services or like being able to do you know being able to do programmatic advertising. And because of the way review worked, like it couldn't take advantage of some of those things. I mean, like that's sort of true of Substack as well. However, like it's not as dramatic with Substack because it has more features baked in. But I think that I think that that's probably what yeah. I think that for some people with review, maybe that's what they were waiting for. But it's been a year. I think that like I got the impression, from, and this is just speaking for me, that they're just trying to see how far they can grow, just like having the option to like share newsletters. And to be clear, they did some things like for example, like if you share a review issue within Twitter, it'll have like a much more robust look to it like as a Twitter card than like a traditional link would.
Yeah, I
And
noticed like the headlines are larger.
yeah, and also you can add in a little like blurb like suggesting people subscribe to your newsletter from review or
Yeah.
via review like on your Twitter profile, which um I think that those things are like good starting points for network effects, but I think that there's probably more that could be done. Um,
Yeah, I agree, and it just seemed like there was just like yeah, and you mentioned the programmatic advertising. That was another kind of thing that I was kind of speculating on is like, could Twitter build out ad products where review newsletters can opt into some kind of classifieds or some kind of programmatic thing that's part of Twitter's ad network, and like advertisers could have their ads automatically inserted into review newsletters, and who knows, maybe that's on the horizon, but it just seems like there wasn't much going on the review side. I didn't really see the kind of number of updates that I was seeing on Substack and some other platforms, so that was kind of disappointing. But then they rolled out the this long form content platform Notes, which all of a sudden I'm excited again. I saw you post about it. I somehow didn't even know that this was coming down the pike. So I'll be really eager to get my hands on it. Once they release it to the public. So let's zoom out a little bit and can you explain? Obviously, podcast is not a visual medium. Can you explain like what Twitter Notes is in terms of like what the user sees?
yeah, so one of the things that I'll say is that Twitter's been adding a number of features to like the internal platform, and one of the ones that they added within last year, beyond the super follows, is something called communities, which works within the Twitter interface and basically is a way to like create a smaller group. Sorry. Um, and Twitter communities is basically a way to create like a smaller group around like a basic interest, and that that's just one of the things that they've launched within within the last 12 months or so. And like that, Twitter Notes sort of works within the posting interface of Twitter. It has its own little tab, and when you launch it and you like start to put out a new article, you have the option to work within sort of like the three like panel setup that they have uh, that they have like by default, like if you're working like in the settings interface. But you can also, but there's also like an option to expand it so that you have like a really clean interface. Although I gotta say, I'm working with a 32-inch monitor here, and I think that like the width of this, the width of this like typing interface is like maybe 600 pixels wide, so it feels a little small. um,
Yeah.
yeah, but at the same time, it's designed so that you can write as much as you can write basically as much as you'd like. You can basically talk about like what you can basically talk about things in depth. You can you can drop you can drop links to other things. Twitter embeds
It's
obvious.
Yeah, it's more like a traditional blogging platform, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
yeah, you can have more formatting that you can have than you normally have with like Twitter.
yeah, and you can actually, I mean, like I said, it's sort of like you can you can format it more than you might a traditional tweet, but less than say, Facebook has increased its formatting within the last couple of years, and that's much more robust than this. Just to
Oh
offer like
wow.
a point of example, but
Yeah.
uh, but I would say that one of the things that this interface does very well is you can embed tweets in it obviously, and those look really nice. And I think that like if you treat it as an extension of like what you're already tweeting about, there's it actually it can be a very useful tool that like you work into your routine much as you might like trying to build a bunch of Twitter threads.
Yeah. And to be clear, like it's an embeddable product in the sense of like it's not like once they release this to the public, all of a sudden you're going to see these super long tweets within your feed. The tweet is still only 280 characters, but within it, like below it, is in this embedded note. And in order to actually see the entire note, you have to click on that, just like if you were to click on a link to the New York Times or something like that, and then it would expand it in the browser. So like you have to take an extra action in order to see the whole note. So it's not going to really change the Twitter experience for the average user because they're only going to see 280 characters, so their feed won't like all of a sudden have these super long posts in them, right?
Yeah, I mean, like it's definitely a situation where you know, much like Substack and other newsletter platforms already kind of work. Um, it tends to support it tends to support the idea of just being able to you know just being able to write and just being able to link off like other things that you've written. It just happens that this is more of a second a second party platform, I guess you could say, rather than a third party platform.
Yeah, and what are the ways for users to engage with notes? Like, can they reply? Is there a comment section? They can retweet it. How to like what are all the different things they can do to a note?
I mean, like as far as as far as what they can do, they can share the link to the note, and that'll like show up as an embed within a tweet. You can actually link off the note, and you should be able to read it even if you're not signed in, which I'm sure a lot of people were actually probably worried about, like when they heard about this feature. And there's and I think I think beyond that, like it's sort of I think that there's probably a bit of room to kind of you know to kind of experiment with it to some degree. I'm sure that there are a lot of things I haven't even thought about yet. Because I was thinking to myself, like, if you really wanted to, you could probably leverage this to sort of do like, something really clever. Like, there was there's this thing that I saw Rusty Foster from Today in Tabs do with the comment section of a Substack about 6 months ago, where he basically
Mhm.
turned into this giant choose your own adventure style thing, and it was really sort of ambitious in terms of what he did. And I feel like you kind of do something like that with this if you really wanted to, and that like you could probably make it so that it's like you know you could probably do some like more experimental like storytelling approaches with with notes that you add in, and you write out like um and as far as like trying to like find the notes, like one of the other things that it does is like to your profile page it adds a tab next to tweets and replies with the word notes, and all your published notes will show up there. So as a
Mhm.
result, like, you know, if if you publish a lot of notes, like it'll be a good spot where people can kind of look back and see, oh, that's what he wrote 3 months ago.
Yeah, but so let's say you read a great note. The only way to, if you're like, I really like this writer, I want to follow him. The only way to do that is to follow him on Twitter, him or her on Twitter. Like, it's not like can you embed a newsletter sign? There's not an automatically embedded newsletter sign up form. Can you embed a newsletter sign up form into a Twitter note?
No, nothing like that yet. I think that like it's at this point it's not like super. Yeah, there's it's kind of a limited interface in terms of like what you can add at this juncture. I would say that I would say that like yeah, you are within the walled garden when you use this. So
Yeah,
I
and I, and
imagine.
I And I wonder if, like, I mean, why did they do this? Like, why, they have this newsletter platform review. Like, why didn't they just build it so, like, reviews can automatically become notes and then drive newsletter signups? Like, yeah, like, why did they make it, at least the initial version of it, as something that's so within the walled garden that there's not, like, you can't drive newsletter subscriptions with it? I wonder.
Um, I think that I think that it's one of those things where you know I can't I don't know how much I can really speculate on what their long term plans are, but I do think that like maybe they're thinking about this in terms of Twitter sort of being like trying to keep trying to keep like creators like on platform as much as they can. That I
Yeah.
think is sort of where my brain kind of goes with that. Whereas it's not necessarily a newsletter. And one of the things that I think is an option for people who have like big off platform preferences, like myself, is you could basically use this sort of the way that you do Twitter threads, in that you could basically create like teases that live as notes,
Yeah.
and like have like elements of stories that that you could use. Like maybe you hold off like maybe if you're doing like a longer form piece, you hold off like a chunk of it and use it as kind of a starting point for a note, like to get people into the longer to get people into the longer piece.
Yeah. And regardless, you could always have a link somewhere within the note itself saying, if you like this, sign up for my newsletter over here. But obviously that's not going to have as high as conversion as like an actual embedded form of some sort.
Yeah, and I think that that's totally fair. And I imagine that like in some ways, like since this appears to be kind of a ground up build, like maybe like what they're planning for this is over time, it becomes this is like the starting point for something more robust with writing. I and
Yeah.
that if that's the case, like that would be a pretty good option if you ask me.
Yeah. Do you think you're going to experiment with mid range, and maybe in addition to sending it as a newsletter, maybe try to cross post it as a Twitter note to see what kind of engagement it's getting or anything like that?
I've thought about that. I think that like that would be that would potentially be a good approach, especially since at this time like I'm in the midst of moving it to its own site. It I'm basically linking off like email versions like via my email provider, which obviously isn't the greatest thing for SEO or for shareability on social platforms. But I think that I think that in this specific sense where like I'm between providers, I guess you could say, it would make sense.
Hmm. And I don't know how much you've been following the discourse over Twitter super follows, but they kind of launched it several months ago. some of the initial reports on how many subscribers it was driving was pretty low, but then they were also only limiting it to a small number of creators, so it's hard to figure out how successful it is. But there have been people who have been very skeptical that consumers will want to pay $5 a month or whatever to just gain access to exclusive tweets of 280 characters. Like, what's the value of a tweet? What do you think? Like, do you think like this notes feature, and they're also like I should also say that I think they're building out the capability for subscriber only Twitter Spaces, which are like these live audio rooms. Do you think this is all part of like a plan to build a more robust like subscription product within Twitter, so that creators can offer live access to them through Twitter Spaces, long form writing through Twitter Notes? Like, do you think that's kind of the end game here?
I think to some degree, like it definitely feels like they're working towards being a one-stop shop for creators.
Mm-hmm.
I think the challenge is because they have all these new features, like their current design doesn't necessarily it doesn't necessarily offer like an easy way for prioritization. Just to sort of give you an example, I I was also an early tester of the communities platform, which I do run a community. It's basically a Twitter version of the Newsletter Nerds group that I run on Facebook. And one of the things that I've noticed with that is because I signed up for Twitter Blue at some point, um, the the Twitter Blue account doesn't actually, or like it adds a couple of things to the sidebar on the web version of the Twitter interface. So like the communities tab is buried under more, which means that it has a visibility problem. The
Yeah.
notes that
And
the
remind us what Twitter Blue is. That's from the Scroll acquisition.
Partly it's the scroll acquisition is part of it, but it's basically a $2.99 a month premium version of Twitter that offers some of the scroll stuff as far as like ad free experiences on different websites that it pays it basically pays the publisher if you read it like out of like a pool of money or whatever. And it also has a few other features, like it offers like a list of top articles. And sort of the big feature is that like you know it delays posting any individual tweet like for a minute before it like actually goes online, just in case you want to second guess yourself.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so the addition of all those features, while it makes it a nice service, it also like adds a bunch of extra tabs, which pushes down these new like features that Twitter's actually testing like on the web interface. Which, I mean, I guess having a lot of stuff that you're working on, like it makes sense that like some of it we compete with other things, but
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, I think that like it sort of highlights a challenge that Twitter faces as the platform becomes more complex.
Yeah. So, what would you say if based on your use of the product, do you have a wish list at all of other features you would want out of it? Obviously, mine would be a newsletter embed form of some kind. Is there anything from your experience that you would like to see better version of it?
Yeah, I think that like I would love to see like a little bit more visibility in terms of like the notes feature like on the website, so that if you want to like write a note, like you're sort of encouraged to do that. Like I think the way that you could I think the way that it can be done is like if you like try to do a new tweet, like you basically could create a way like, oh, like you're getting close to 280 characters, like do you want to extend this thought in notes,
Oh yeah, that would be great.
yeah,
Yeah.
like I think that would be a really smart way to solve for the problem of like getting that sort of thing into the mix. And one of the ways that the Twitter has managed to like get communities in there a little bit more is like when you like when you tweet now, there's actually a little box right above the top of the tweet, like on the website, that can change the audience from everyone to your list of groups. So, that I think that like the solution to all of Twitter's like problems with visibility is going to be through the tweet interface. But
Yeah.
as far as other feature I'd like to see, currently there are limitations to how big or small the images can be. Like basically they're sort of like default sizes, which if you're trying to build like more of a newslettery kind of thing with the notes interface, like like it kind of limits you a bit, because then like you can't do like fancy like fancy squiggly lines to like separate things. You have to use Twitter's interface to do it. And I think that I think that there's probably a little bit more room for formatting. Like I said earlier, there's obviously going to be a balance between simplicity and and complexity with all this.
Yeah.
Like, you don't want to add too many features to the the website that is known for being a very simple place to communicate. So.
Yeah.
But I think to some degree you could probably center a little bit, and I think that it'd be kind of cool, like if you have if you have like a profile, for example, that like has like certain theme colors, which I don't think the current Twitter interface actually does that, but I know prior interfaces you could actually like set sort of like a default color for everything. Like I think that would be that would be a good way to just sort of like, give yourself a brand color and have it like kind of bleed through to the Twitter notes interface, for example.
Yeah,
So,
I'm super excited about it. I hope sometimes they tend to, like, these companies, they tend to wait too long to roll it out to the rest of the people. Like they'll have like a beta like group to test it out, and then it just takes forever, and then kind of like the excitement is kind of gone by the time they finally roll it out. So I hope they do it soon, because I'd love to play around with it myself. So it's great. I guess like we were talking best case scenario, worst case scenario. I don't know if you remember Facebook. There was this brief like pattern within the blogging community several years back, because they launched like a revamped notes tool. Do you remember this? And basically they always had this notes tool, but it was very limited in functionality, and they relaunched it so that it actually had like a ton more blogging functionality, a lot more formatting and stuff like that. Is this ringing a bell to you at all?
yeah, it is. I mean, but I mean, Facebook has sort of had this problem like on multiple fronts as well. Like, they also have a newsletter tool, bulletin, that nobody talks about.
Yeah, well, that hasn't been launched to everybody yet. That's still, talking about how kind of that whole, focusing on like a beta community, and then you kind of lose interest in it. But yeah, they launched this notes tool several years back, and they just did nothing with it. There was it had no prominent place on like pages or profiles. Like you had to know where to look just to find it. I played around with it a little bit, and basically nobody today uses it. So that's like a good example of just, rolling out a tool, not doing anything to promote it or anything like that, and then it just dying. I guess the analogous thing on Twitter would be its audiograms kind of thing, where you could record like 60 seconds of audio. And I don't see anybody using that at all. I wouldn't be surprised if they get rid of it pretty soon. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Twitter. On Twitter notes, I'm super excited to try it out once it goes out to the wider community. Ernie, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
The best spot to find me is I am on Twitter at shortform Ernie, SHORTFORMERNIE. My newsletter is Tedium, is at TEDIUM.co. Mid-range, I'm still in the midst of relaunching it, but probably the spot you'll find it is midrange.tdm.co. And from there, I'll see you on the internet.
Well, awesome. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast, so if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.